The Changelog is one of the most popular software engineering podcasts in existence. Open source software moves fast, and the Changelog helps software engineers keep up with that rapid pace by publishing consistent podcasts and newsletters. When I started Software Engineering Daily, the Changelog was one of the podcasts that I looked to for inspiration on how to succeed as a software engineering editorialist or podcaster. Adam Stacoviak and Jerod Santo are the hosts of the Changelog, and they join me today to discuss how open source has changed since they started the podcast in 2009 and how it will change in the near future. Before we get started, I want to take a quick moment to thank the people that have been tweeting and posting and telling their friends about Software Engineering Daily, because the community is growing and it's really meaningful to me that people are taking the time to help us out with that growth. I also want to let you know about our Slack channel and our newsletter, both of which you can sign up for at softwareengineeringdaily.com. So thanks for getting involved with the community. It really means a lot to me. After a quick message from today's sponsor, we will get to this episode, The Changelog, with Adam Stacoviak and Jerod Santo. Podcasting full-time is a great career, but if I ever return to the normal world of work, Hired.com is where I will start my job hunt. Hired.com removes the frustration of searching for a job. You just fill out your profile and the jobs come to you. Facebook, Uber, and Stripe are a few of the companies that are hunting for engineers on Hired. Go to hired.com/SEDaily to try it out and get an extra $1,000 signing bonus just for using the URL for Software Engineering Daily listeners, which is hired.com/SEDaily. So if you want to try it out, go to hired.com/SEDaily. The demand for engineers is higher than the supply. And on hired.com, that translates to higher salaries and happier careers for the engineers who find a job on Hired. I used Hired to find a job before I became a full-time podcaster. And the experience was so good because Hired connected me with a talent advocate who worked with me to find a job that was a good fit. And the talent advocate answered my questions about negotiating salary and finding remote work, which was something that was really important to me at the time. So check out hired.com/SEDaily and get a $1,000 signing bonus upon finding a job, which will be a great job that will give you the respect and the salary that you deserve as a great engineer. So check out hired.com/SEDaily. It would support the show. And now let's get on with today's episode of Software Engineering Daily. Jerod Santo and Adam Stacoviak are the hosts of The Changelog, a podcast about open source software and the people who make it. Jerod and Adam, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Yes, sir.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hey.
So let's start by talking about open source itself. How has open source software changed since you started The Changelog in 2009?
Yeah, 2009.
Okay.
I don't know, man. It's definitely gotten faster. We started out saying open source moves fast, keep up. And I feel like that's been a tried and true statement, that it's only gotten faster and that it's obviously gotten more social thanks to GitHub and people following that methodology of social coding. I think that it's obviously gotten a lot more interesting, a lot more diverse. And I think it's because software's gotten more diverse, not so much open source, but people are, man, I hope this doesn't come back to bite me, but I feel like it's the 70s a little bit, Jerod. Where it's sort of hippie-ish in a way, in a good way. And it's sort of the hippie revolution coming back, because open source kind of reminds me of that peace, love, and happiness kind of thing, where everybody is all about keeping the peace and all about inclusion and diversity and equality and things like that, which are all great things. But I feel like it's this new thing that's come back from the era of the 70s, which is kind of interesting to me. What do you think, Jerod?
Yeah, I would add that, since 2009, I think everything has gotten centralized around GitHub, so much so that even large corporations are embracing open source, notably Microsoft, Apple, Facebook. I think Google always kind of did from their roots. But, we've seen bigger players come in and mix it up and have huge impacts, and then also have fallout. So corporate interests are even more so aligned with open source than they've ever been. I think it's
Do
changing.
you guys think that like the increasing globalization of software development is going to change open source more? Because like I just figure, I mean, obviously we have increase in diversity on a domestic scale, like more women and minorities, for example, are becoming software engineers. But also you just think about like if all these people from say Africa and China, they start to come into the open source community and sort of by Metcalfe's law, the network is the square of the nodes in the network. As we get more people from international places starting to contribute to open source, we might start to have this, even bigger increase in scope and diversity of the types of open source software we see.
Yeah. And maintenance burden.
And maintenance burden.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maintenance.
And I think it makes our jobs as people who track open source and cover open source and talk about software engineering and the ecosystem, it makes our job, I think, more important because as you have more noise, it's harder to find the signals.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're looking for that library that, parses JSON in your particular language, and there's now 600 of them with different implementations or various levels of support and communities. Yeah, finding the one that's right for you becomes more difficult. But
okay, so what leads to an open source project either succeeding or failing?
You want that one, Adam?
I think what leads to open source leading or succeeding or failing, it starts with the community. I mean, obviously it's around the software, but it depends on the community propping it up because we see this in several different camps where communities are beginning to fall apart or they're becoming just less communicative, that it's really around the community. And then obviously the software's got to have a true need and meet a true need and solve a true problem. But I think it really resolves around people. I think, one of the most interesting, I think, that we've done around the changelog, and obviously, as Jerod has said, tracking open source is less just around the software. Like it began there. The original idea was obviously as a changelog. We thought, let's create a podcast around talking around the changes from version to version of software. And that obviously has gotten to a much bigger idea. But, it started out with let's track the software. And I think what's really interesting and what really defines success for an open source project is the people behind it, because without the people, you don't have the software.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that obviously the community is so important as a point of leverage, but perhaps I think the most successful open source projects, they often have a charismatic leader at the center of them. Like with Linux, you have Linus Torvalds, and Rails, you have David Heinemeier Hansson. Is that a trend, or do you see open source projects that do not have any centralized charismatic leader?
That's a tough one.
I would say strong leadership is, a necessary part of any thriving community.
Yeah.
Charismatic leader, I think that's a little bit of a slight distinction away from, strong leadership.
Somebody who's definitely an influencer. I think that's the trait you're really looking forward towards is they have to be able to influence people, not so much just charismatic.
Very true. They have to influence people, but maybe they don't necessarily need to win friends in the case of Linus Torvalds.
Yeah, we're not talking about the book here, but I mean, it is about influence.
I wasn't going to name names there, Jeff, but you did. You named names.
If no one could influence anybody, then you're not going to get any followers. So I think it takes a level of following somebody down a particular path, whether it's an ideology or a paradigm or a language or a new direction. I think it takes somebody who's influential and obviously somebody who's intelligent too. But I don't think charismatic. Yeah. I think charismatic leads into it only in so much as drama and just things like that get people excited because everybody loves drama. Everybody kind of like gravitates towards it. Maybe not the day-to-day community we interact with, but the large majorities of people really, that's why there's reality TV, right? You don't watch that. You don't watch certain news stations or whatever because they're informative. That's great, but it's also the drama people tend to gravitate towards. But I don't think that's what makes or breaks an open source community.
I'm trying to think of a strong community that doesn't have strong leadership. Of course, we have that statement, the BDFL, right? The benevolent dictator for life, which some people think is absolutely necessary to the success of a project. And so we have people like DHH, like Guido van Rossum, and so on. I'm sure there are other projects that don't have a single leader, but they have to have strong leadership. Sometimes that's represented in a core group. I think of Node with the IO split and then the reforming and the foundation formed and that board. Adam, I don't even know how it works anymore, but I know everything's voted on and it's group decision. And so, yeah, I mean, you have people who think you have to have a single leader, and then you have other people that think it can work in a more democratic way. But I think the key is strong leadership, whether it's a single person or a group.
And I think on that note too, Jerod, is a nemesis, right? It kind of reminds me of Zed Shaw, right? Zed Shaw versus DHH in a way. I think it was Zed Shaw, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
Sure. Linux versus Microsoft.
Right. Having somebody who's against the leader is also a good thing.
Curl versus wget.
Yeah. Yeah.
That one's kind of fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different verticals of open source. There's, you've got front end projects like React and Elm and Vue.js, and then there's like back end projects such as Hadoop. And then there's projects that are important for both back-end and front-end development. There's Ruby on Rails, Node.js, Docker. Do you guys have any particular preference for which area that you focus on at the changelog?
Zero. Zero preference.
Zero preference.
And we cover what's fresh and new in open source, and that's been our staple. But I think it's grown more and more, as we kind of said a little bit ago, where it's more around people. So we like to highlight things that really are interesting, obviously, the right kind of people, the right kind of projects, the right kind of ideas, the right kind of influencers, not just simply around the right kind of area of open source that really matters. Like, we're agnostic to open source. We think it's more of a movement, an ideology. And that's, I think, helped us over the years, because whenever you see certain camps flounder or certain camps become stale or become old or not cool anymore, or whatever, we've been able to keep our brand name, so to speak, untarnished by any sort of change in the equilibrium of open source, because we're agnostic and we think that there's interesting things. Jerod, you can back me up on this, but we see interesting things too as we interview so many different people that lead open source that are influenced by other languages. Like, we just talked to Mats, and Mats was influenced by pretty much everything, wasn't he, Jerod? Like, he took all of his likes of Smalltalk, of Pascal, and all these interesting languages, and said, let me create a Ruby that matters to me. Let me create a language that matters to me. And I think that's what you find in open source, is that you see that it doesn't really matter where you come from in terms of a paradigm. It's sort of like, what is driving technology forward and making software more useful?
Yeah, I've always been a generalist myself. I think, there's certain people who say specialize, be the Hadoop expert. And I think that's a completely legitimate career path or way about going about your work. I've always found it more interesting to generalize and try to touch on as many things in software development as you can, because, everything fits together, whether as a house of cards or as a beautiful, mesh network, however you want to view that, but it all comes together. And so, we're very much generalists. We go where there's interesting people and interesting technologies. And I think that our job in exposing new ideas and new things, if we were focused simply on front end or focused simply on the web, which honestly, if we do have a bent, it's towards web, but that's just more out of habit.
Why has software development evolved in a way where people tend to think that they need to specialize in a specific vertical? Because I remember, for example, I'm the same way as you guys. I think of myself as a generalist. I love touching on these different things. And I also don't really like this idea of, oh, you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. I see no reason why you can't, maybe not master all of these things, but get a really good understanding of all of these things if you really want to. But I see certain pressures from maybe corporations or from the certain assembly line mentality that certain schools teach that maybe drive us towards this path that say, oh, you need to be a Spring expert and that's going to be your career for life, or you need to be a Rails expert, you need to be a Hadoop expert. And these, perhaps software hasn't been around long enough for people to realize that these are kind of dogmas that we're getting shoehorned into, but or maybe I'm just on a soapbox. What do you guys think?
I mean, I would hop on your soapbox with you. So if you are on a soapbox, just let me join you and say that now you don't want to get pigeonholed into a specific technology.
It's a podium.
Oh, yes. Let me join you on your podium.
It can't be a soapbox. That's too small.
Fair enough. So from this podium, let's just say that it's important to understand the full stack. It's important to see the big picture. And not be a quote unquote Rails developer. I know, people used to say, are you a jQuery developer? Are you a React developer? No, I'm a software developer. Do I know React? Sure, a little bit. I could stand to learn it better, but I'm sure I could do that in a fashion that is productive as well. And so we need to be able to cross boundaries, and we need to be able to move on, because what's in today is out tomorrow. And even more so, that's becoming truer and truer. And so, yeah, you don't want to put yourself inside of a pigeonhole.
Those are small.
Those are small. So open source is important, and it's always going to be important. But there are an increasing number of paid software products that are closed source, but are incredibly useful, like AWS, or you think of all these software as a service products like Dropbox or Trello or Asana, CodeShip, maybe. And it's very different from the days of shelfware, when the software that you bought off the shelf was totally outdated and terrible the minute that you bought it. Like these days, it's not like, the open source software is just definitively better than the closed source software. Oftentimes, the closed source software is taking care of things that open source sort of by definition cannot take care of, like just very easy deployment or procurement or whatever. So do you guys think that the world of closed source software, is it evolving in a way that makes it more appealing to you to like report on perhaps, or to think about? Because like there are types of closed source software services that you could think like these are so useful to developers, and it wouldn't make sense as an open source project, like CodeShip, right? Wouldn't necessarily make sense as an open source project. So do you guys think about reporting on closed source software?
I mean, it's interesting. There's always a commercial angle to it, and that's kind of where we find sponsors and partners where we still do help tell their story. But if they're going to reap any benefits from our promotional ability, so to speak, then we say, we open those arms up, but we say, pay us. Help us out, because we need to sustain ourselves. And, open source is free and open source, and there's a community around it. And the way we've found to fund, so to speak, our ways, which is just one of the ways, not the only way. But we find ourselves going out to those interesting, closed-sourced, commercial gaining organizations and saying, hey, if you want to work with us, then you can. You can support open source through working with us, and then we can also promote your software and find unique ways to promote what you're doing.
Okay, I see. So I guess
it doesn't mean we won't report on it, but
right.
The impetus of the changelog didn't start with closed source. It started with open source.
Yeah.
And so for those reasons, it would seem like pulling the rug out from underneath anyone who followed us. That doesn't mean we can't add to, but I don't see the changelog itself, the podcast, ever changing from shying away from covering open source. Mm-hmm. Will we create a new show that focuses a bit more on something like that? Potentially. But the changelog proper as a podcast will always remain open source focused.
And I think open source is so pervasive amongst these new closed source, software services or products that even a couple that you named, we could definitely go and interview people at Trello and talk about the open source stuff that happens at Trello, because they're definitely involved in that. Or AWS has an entire world of open source software built around it. We've had Facebook on the show to talk about React and React Native, and we're trying to get them back on. We're scheduling with them to talk about just the general conversation of open source at Facebook, because there's so much going on there, even though Facebook is a closed source platform.
Right.
So I think there's angles into it, but I think the open is always where we're going to focus.
In the past, it seems like the long-term arc of closed source software is that eventually developers who use it, they get locked in, and they might eventually resent the software. So this happened with Windows, it happened with Oracle, more recently kind of happening with AWS, and maybe potentially creating an opportunity for things like Azure and Google. What do you guys think about these different models for building closed source software? Is there a way to maybe take lessons from the open source world where you can build closed source software in a way that doesn't lead to developers resenting what you build?
It's going to be impossible, I think.
Yeah,
things change too much.
And people like free stuff.
I was just laughing the other day, and I'm not going to say the name of the company, but I was laughing. We were at my wife's company, and somebody held up something I laughed at, or they were like, hey, check out this spec book. And it was like literally a book. and it was a spec book of a particular area of their product. And I kind of scoffed, and I feel bad now doing it, but I kind of scoffed because it's like this old waterfall way of doing things. And I think software, you sort of iterate through it, so you never really know where you're trying to go. You're trying to solve a problem. And, iterating through it, you eventually get to maybe a place where people don't exactly want you to be. And, you're not always following the right section of the crowd to solve the problem. I think, you end up in a way where you eventually offend someone. And that's how you have competition.
I don't think resenting, software that you use is a domain, specifically taken out by closed sourced proprietary things.
No.
There's plenty of people who feel entrapped by their open source projects
That's
as well,
true,
and end up resenting them just as much. So I don't know if there's any lessons to learn from either side.
No.
That's a very good point. So, I think, Adam, you mentioned GitHub earlier, or Jerod maybe, as kind of this inflective point on what enabled open source to really take off. Do you think we will see another point of inflection with Docker Hub?
I don't know. I don't have enough experience with Docker Hub, but something I've heard recently was, who was it? Somebody was using something from there. No, it was actually, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's the Hitler movie that they use in memes. And
oh yeah.
Stop me if you've seen this one recently, but there was a new one around Docker and Docker Hub, and it was like this interesting thing around how the node was using a public Docker image on Docker Hub, and how that was like a no-no because you never know what's in there, kind of stuff. And long story short, I think that's certainly opening up the door to things like that, but I don't know. I don't have enough experience with it personally to say yes or no. I think it's interesting though.
Right. So maybe potential security vulnerabilities or something. Yeah, I should.
Well, I mean, if you're using a public image and you haven't investigated the code and you're just willy-nilly using it, then it could potentially do something really negative towards you. I don't know. Jerod, do you have any experience with Docker Hub?
No, I got 0, which is why I'm just kind of sitting quietly over here. I'm kind of a Docker Luddite, whereas with Git, I embrace Git immediately, and I gave it a huge hug. And I know a lot of people, especially that were happy with Subversion, kind of didn't see it at first. And maybe I'm just setting, now I'm becoming the Luddite, and I'm just like, Docker, I get it. I understand what it does. I've talked to people about it. I've seen Docker files everywhere, and it doesn't fit in my workflow yet. So I'm just completely on the sidelines for that one.
Yeah, likewise. I've entered Docker on the command line less than 10 times, so I'm totally Luddite, imposter, or whatever.
I was also in not long ago, I was in a local meetup, and it was packed because it had the word Docker in the title for the talk. And I think it's this interesting box that solves a problem for a good majority of people in ops, but for the general developer day to day, there's interesting things that it does, but as you said, Jerod, it just hasn't entered your workflow. And while it's interesting as a generalist potentially to always keep your eyes on something like that, and because it is so interesting, it does some very unique things and enables some unique things that you want to keep your eye on it. But I find that the more and more people I talk to, they pay attention to it, but they never actually use it day to day. It's sort of like in this particular area of ops that only is useful there, and there it's really useful, But
yeah, and I think
not for everybody.
Again, also because I don't collaborate too tightly in large teams, and so I have less of the pain of setting somebody else up or having a project that has a Docker file. You can just run it right away. So it depends on, like you said, if you're in an ops team or you're in a large team that's collaborating and you have lots of different projects that each have their own specific dependencies and whatnot. I definitely see the value of Docker and a hub for Docker. I just don't have much insight beyond that.
Oh, ask you a question, reverse question, Jeff. Why did you ask that question? What were you expecting? What do you think about Docker Hub yourself?
Well, I've done a bunch of shows around container stuff recently. A lot of it around Kubernetes and Docker Swarm and Amazon's container service, Mesosphere. And it's kind of hard to see exactly where we're going with this, but it's very clear that there is some serious investment and serious competition around who's going to build the de facto platform that you use to containerize your data center. So right now we just deploy VMs mostly, or we just deploy very straightforward containers that basically look like smaller VMs. But the vision for the future that it seems like these different companies like Amazon and Mesos and Google are trying to lay out is like, you're going to want to run your own data center effectively. You're going to want to have batch jobs, and you're going to want to have long-running jobs like Gmail. If I'm a consumer of a Google technology, I'm going to want to obviously access Gmail, which spins up a container somewhere. And I'm also going to want to have, and Google's going to run batch jobs that are going to process data on me on a nightly basis. And Google wants to be able to manage this across a data center in a way that's really easy for them. And their thinking is, well, in the future, everybody's going to want to do this. Like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you want to have this amazing abstraction that allows you to really easily manage your batch jobs and really easily manage your like user session type jobs like Gmail or Facebook or whatever? And so everybody is realizing this. Well, if you consider everybody to be Mesos, Amazon, Google, etc. And so like that's the vision. And that's kind of why, and I watch Docker out of the corner of my eye and I'm like, okay, I'm not dealing with this day to day because like I'm a full-time software podcaster, right? I'm like not writing code on a daily basis. So all I can do is ask people who are, dealing with the day to day, like, what is exciting about this project to you? And it's just, this thing that just comes up over and over and over again about all these, and there's all these different applications for it. Obviously we see it, on a day-to-day basis, when you talk to people, it's mostly about like, yeah, I'm just using this to help my deployment, standardize my deployment. But the long-term vision for what it enables is so much bigger than that. So it's almost like this primitive that enables so much that we have no idea where it's going to take us, almost like the smartphone or like AWS coming out. That is the sense that I get about what this technology allows. But not having worked with it myself, all I do is just talk to people about it. All I can really do is speculate and hypothesize and ask people like you guys. So,
well, it certainly keeps getting more and more interesting, and it certainly keeps garnering more and more interest. And with that, money, right? Docker started open source, and they went from .cloud to Docker, which we covered way early. We haven't really covered Docker much since then, but it went from .cloud as a service to creating Docker, the open source technology, and now there's a company called Docker, and then obviously a lot more people there and moving this technology forward. So it keeps generating more and more interest.
Okay, I want to talk to you guys about the changelog itself, and some of these questions are somewhat in self-interest because you guys have been podcasting about software for so long. I'd really like to get feel for how you think about doing the podcast and talking to people about software, because I think communications about software, the person-to-person communication aspect is something I could really learn a lot from you guys. I think the listeners could also learn a lot too, because if you get better at communicating about software to people, then you can save so much time in the development process. So just talking in terms of the changelog, how technical do you guys try to get with a given episode of the changelog? How do you figure out the right balance between technicality and approachability?
That's definitely a balance that we struggle to strike. I think some of it we just let happen naturally. We kind of let our own interest and technical ability or lack of ability lead a conversation. We do get together and talk about what are specific things that we think are interesting about this person or this technology. And we try to focus on pulling those things out. How specifically technical to get, sometimes we leave that to the guest. We do tell our guests, you're talking to developers, you're talking to technical people. So feel free to get into the weeds. If you think something is worth explaining at a technical depth and you can do it in audio and not have to draw a diagram or something, take us there and we'll go there with you as far as we can. Sometimes we have to dig them out of the weeds, and bring it back up to a high level. But I don't know if there's necessarily a science behind it, Adam. What do you think?
No, I think the one thing you said, Jerod, and I never really thought about it like that, but we face our imposter syndrome so no one else has to. And I think we kind of take that same, everyone has that self-concern, I guess, that they don't belong or they don't know enough. And if anybody should be hosting this show, it should be Jerod and I, because we know just enough to not know any at all. And but we do. We get there. But I think that when it comes to a science, I don't think there's a real science to it. I think what I think is the beauty of what is now the changelog, because it's actually changed over its time. It's had different hosts working with me on it and stuff like that. But I think what the current version of it is, why I like this version the best, in my opinion, is that it starts with Jerod and I's relationship. Like, he and I know how to talk like anybody else would, but I think Jerod and I have a good relationship. We understand one another, and so we don't compete on the show for mic time. We know that it's not about us, and that it's really about what's interesting and what's important to focus on for that guest, and whether it's technical, whether it's community, whether it's influence, whether it's their background. Jerod and I work really well together to figure out what is important in a very short amount of time. We don't spend a ton of time planning the show. Some shows a bit more than others, but most shows are usually done within maybe an hour, hour and a half of prep, if that. And we share a Google Doc. You know, we have a pretty easy process, but I think it starts with Jerod and I's ability to have a good conversation together and then pull a guest into that and not worry about making the show about us. It's really about the guest. The science is pretty much that, in my opinion, for us, you know, for our show. So
obviously there is some advantage to doing shows about topics that you're really not familiar with, because you can assume that if you're doing reporting on kind of the cutting edge of software, you can assume that most of the listeners have about the same level of experience. Like, they've read something on Hacker News, or like even more likely they've seen a headline on Hacker News, or maybe skimmed an article about a technology, and they know literally nothing else. So in some sense, it's good to begin a show from a beginner's mindset and not have much knowledge about the technology, or not having done some prep.
I'd say the word to use there is outsider, and more so than beginner, because I don't think we ever feel like we're beginners, because we do have history and experience, and that doesn't speak to beginner. I think it's more like an outsider or someone who's newer to something. That doesn't exactly mean you're just beginning. Like, with lack of knowledge is kind of what beginner usually tends to signify. It's more like, in my opinion, it's more like that, like an outsider coming in, or someone who is a little less familiar with it, and almost like a childlike asking, like, hey, what does this do, and why does it work like that? Because that's what the general majority is usually thinking. And again, back to that imposter syndrome thing, they tend to not ask because they're like, I don't want to sound stupid. There's times, Jerod and I, we ask good but silly questions sometimes, just because you can't help it. If you don't understand something, or you don't get why something works the way it does, you ask and you get an answer, hopefully, from the person. And if they're an influencer, if they're a leader, and they have good qualities like that, they're not going to like treat Jerod and I like idiots. They're going to help us understand something, and thereby the audience listening.
There was this recent Stack Overflow survey that put the average experience level of software engineers at 6.5 years, which means, because of that skew, there must be tons of newer developers. What do you think is the average level of experience for a listener of the Changelog?
Oh, man. Jeez, I don't even know.
Years?
We haven't done the survey.
Years or
Years
however whatever benchmark you want to use.
I would say experienced, in my opinion. I don't think, but then again, I'm always surprised, because we get tweets, Jerod, from people that seem to be maybe newer to software development. We even have people on like Rockbot, who hasn't been in long, but she's got a good technology experience given her schooling background and what she's done with, in JavaScript and Node and robots and robotics and stuff. Like, it's really an interesting, diverse crowd. I think what we tend to gravitate towards, and what tend to listen to our show, is less around maybe the experience. I wouldn't say we attract new developers. Maybe we do. I don't really know. I can't really identify my exact thought pattern, because I think that we have a very diverse crowd. Some really, really technical, and some that are really new.
Yeah. I think we serve a pretty broad audience in that regard. People who interact with us. We don't do surveys or anything, and there's no like age or experience analytics. So we don't have, hard facts about any of this. It's all just who talks to us and who we know listens. And anywhere from beginners to very experienced. I think our show is approachable for people who are either outsiders or beginners to specific things. And yet, because we don't focus, we do talk about technical merits and value that software brings and struggles as the leader of a project, or as a maintainer, or, those type of things, which I think are valuable for people of all experiences. So because we're approachable, and yet we also do provide these kind of big picture value propositions and insights and inspiration, I think there's people can have takeaways of all experience levels. I hope so.
Yeah. So one thing I think is interesting about software podcasting is that the changelog has been really successful. And I think one source of that success is that the idea of a high quality software podcast is, for many reasons, is kind of unlikely because so a lot of the podcasts I hear or that I subscribe to or listen to are somewhat similar. Like, so there's a lot of like entrepreneurship podcasts, and you kind of see the same sort of like motivational people talking, the same kind of entrepreneurial people who are building their personal brands and stuff. And a lot of that is, I think, because like these are the people that they have to do, like kind of their job is to market themselves and their persona and their entrepreneurship and whatnot. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's great. But software, on the other hand, like if someone understands software really well, most of the time they're just going to spend all that time, like all their spare time is just going to go to writing code or building some kind of software project, architecting a software project. Generally speaking, they're not going to spend their time doing the types of stuff that you have to do if you're going to be a software podcaster. You're like configuring WordPress or like figuring out your RSS feed or figuring out all the audio jankiness that we spent 7 minutes doing before we got started, which is totally typical for a software podcaster. So I don't know. I don't know what question I'm driving at here, but given how interesting and how expansive the world of software engineering is, why aren't there more great software engineering podcasts?
We ask ourselves that question every single day. And we aim to solve that problem to a degree, but I think you said something that was successful for us is our focus on quality, and that's been our thread since the beginning. If you listen to the early days of the changelog to current days of the changelog, we've definitely gotten better. And it's kind of funny because I was literally going through a hard drive last night trying to organize old files. I like to archive stuff, and I was going through, and I stumbled upon, Jerod, this is going to be funny, I don't know what, but I stumbled on episode 10 of the changelog, and I don't know why, but I caught myself listening to some of it and thinking, this audio is horrible. Wow. But the conversations were great. And so to zoom back out a little bit and not bore you with the details of that episode 10, which happened to include Chris Wanstroth, one of the creators of GitHub, which is a great episode. Go back and listen to it, but don't judge us on audio quality. But what was interesting is that we always focus on good quality, but it didn't mean that it had to be audibly quality. That was always the goal, but it was really focused on great content. And everyone says great content. I think that some of the podcasts you'd mentioned are styles of podcasts where you tend to have this typical interviewee kind of situation, and it's sort of this linear fashion. And that's what the changelog was built upon, and we've gotten better at that over the years with interviewing somebody. But it's what you ask them and the things you focus on that really pull out the right kind of things. And you'd mentioned that we talk to people, or software podcasts talk to people that don't tend to be, self-promotional. Jerod, there's been at least a couple of times I can recall where we've talked to somebody like, this is the first time I've actually talked to somebody like this week. I've been focusing so much on writing code. And I think that's the beauty of it, is because we talk to people that need to tell the world about what they're doing. Someone in particular I could think of is like Tim Caswell. I don't know how often he gets on a podcast, but when he does, it's great because the guy goes deep. He's always he's not on it. He is the edge in terms of a lot of stuff he's working on. And I'm always taken back by the things he's talking about. And so he's one good example of someone we've had on the show that's just like, get him on a podcast and have him just talk about what he's doing, because that's going to be interesting. And I think that's kind of the successful point that we've focused on, and we've sort of tried to push that button harder and harder as we go along.
So the podcast infrastructure for the web, in many ways, it's exactly the same as it was when podcasts were invented. Basically, you subscribe to an RSS. I mean like
infrastructure.
The infrastructure. Yeah. So like you subscribe to an RSS feed and then you just get MP3s.
Right.
Have you guys do you see any signs on the wall that podcast usage and distribution is going to change meaningfully in the near future?
Oh, Jerod, you take that one, man. Or I could take
in terms of how we distribute the audio, or in terms of how people consume it.
Actual market. I think over time people have tried to have these like boil the ocean solutions, where whether you think of Stitcher or I don't know, basically anything.
Great ideas that will never change they may influence, but I think there's such a stronghold from iTunes that it's like we're a small fish in a very, very, very big universe, not even ocean, because like it goes beyond the ocean.
Strangely managed, walled garden, somewhat universe.
And it's so the shame there is, since we're talking specifically about that, I think that it's just a shame because there's so many things that Jerod and I have personally talked about on ways to improve the overall thing, but everyone is locked into it. Like the idea of how podcasts are distributed right now, I don't think is going to change. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it'll change for 5 years at least. I mean, I think it's getting to the maybe I'm wrong. Jerod, slap me in the face if I'm wrong, but I just don't see it changing because it's such a Goliath. And Apple is just so huge and they have such a stronghold on it. They have such a marketability towards the devices, the software, and then ultimately the platform that it all sits upon. No one hosts their podcast on iTunes, but it's all distributed through iTunes. And since they are the largest provider, they tend to dictate, much like Google does with search. And so for that reason, if they don't change, it doesn't change. And so it begins with Apple, in my opinion. Like, I think if you're listening to the show and you're from Apple and you're involved in that area, come talk to us. We have ideas, or just listen to the market, or at least change, because you haven't and you're breaking the system, even though you made it.
Hey, you guys should talk to the folks at Acast. I don't know if you have, but I had a very interesting conversation with somebody from Acast recently. They're kind of trying to be the Spotify of podcasts. It's a bunch of ex-Spotify people working on this podcast platform that's pretty ambitious, but pretty interesting. Maybe I'll put you in touch with them. Anyway, so, okay. You guys have mentioned the 3 C's of podcasting, which is content, consistency, and community. And I think that these 3 are definitely keys to building a successful podcast. Maybe they were all that you needed several years ago, but these days there are so many podcasts, and it can be hard to break out and gain growth and popularity, even if you just have really good quality content, consistency, and some community. Is there anything else that you guys have done to encourage growth? Is there anything in particular? This is obviously like somewhat in self-interest, but anything you do to market the Changelog that works particularly well?
Well, I think that podcast marketing is broken. I don't think that's kind of where Jerod and I begin with some of the problems we'd solve with podcasts and how they're distributed is being able to promote them. Because we feel like the only way that we can see that people find us is when someone says, hey, on Twitter, they say, hey, I'm interested in getting into podcasts. Which ones do you recommend? And we see our name pop up in a slew of other names. And so that's, on the marketing side of it. But in terms of a good show and getting a market for that show, I think it totally stands on those 3 C's. It begins and ends with content and ends with quality, and the community can't be dismissed from that, because if not, you wouldn't have anybody listening to it. And you have to focus on quality, and I think quality is an expansive topic where it's not just the audio quality, it's also the quality of the content and the community around it. I think those things are exactly what you should focus on, and focusing on anything else is a loss leader, because if you don't have those 3 things, then you don't have a podcast.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Unfortunately, audio doesn't travel online like video does and like text does. It just does not. You never heard of a viral audio clip.
Right.
I haven't.
No.
Like a serial podcast.
Listen to this.
Is the one thing that, traveled, and that actually spread mostly word of mouth and got some media coverage and stuff. And because it was mass market appeal, it actually moved beyond the bounds of most podcasts. And we're all grateful for Serial because it actually expanded the audience for podcasts quite a bit.
I think it gave an open eye to how serious of a medium it can be. And I think people listen to Serial and whatnot in very unique places. You can take video there, but video requires your eyeballs, it requires a lot more attention, whereas a podcast you can sort of listen to if you wanted to, and you can sort of pay attention to if you wanted to.
Okay, but was Serial actually that great, or do you think it was just in the right place at the right time? Like, it happened to be this podcast that was like,
I have to be honest here. I have literally not listened to Serial.
And I listened to like half of the first season, and I was like, I
didn't listen to any of it for a reason. I didn't want to be tainted. And the reason why I don't want to be tainted is because I'm sure that the style of production is very interesting and very good. And the way it was produced, it obviously sounds great. I didn't want to be influenced in a bad way where if anything I ever did would copy something like it. So that's one though. But I purposely didn't want to listen to it because I feel like it's like the prettiest girl in the room, and you don't want to look at her, right? I'm taken for one thing, but you don't want to look at that girl because it's like Medusa, it'll turn you into stone or something like that. I feel like
Medusa was really ugly though.
Medusa was really ugly, and she also had snakes in her head,
snakes
something like that.
Hair. Yeah.
But the point is if you looked at her, something bad would happen. So that's kind of how I feel about Serial. It's like Serial's not a woman. Serial's gender agnostic, I'm sure, but the fact is like I just didn't listen to it because I didn't want to be tainted by it. And I think that those styles of shows can be really interesting. And I think that if you apply that same kind of science in terms of how they designed the show, designed that podcast, if you took that same science and applied it to our world, things would get very interesting.
Yeah, it's very expensive to produce a podcast of that quality. I think Serial was right place, right time, but it was also a compelling story. And so I think at least America, but perhaps, the global market woke up to the fact that podcasting is a medium in which you can create compelling, high quality, highly produced content, whereas previously it was viewed as like
amateur,
two guys in their basement talking about space aliens or whatever that stigma is.
Right.
I think it legitimized the medium.
Yes.
But the show itself was not.
It was quite a risk because basically they were like, okay, we're basically going to do an audio book that is a season of a podcast, and we're going to invest so much resources into it. And it was that sense of continuity. Like if you listen to our podcast, it's like there's no continuity from one episode to another other than like, oh, it's Jared and Adam again, or oh, it's Jeff again, and now he's reporting on something completely different, and there's no continuity.
Right. Well, I don't think so. I think I don't disagree completely, but I've been listening to audiobooks on Audible for years, like literally since like 2007, like as early as I can go back with Audible. Like I never got the free code because they came out after I started using it. That's how long I've been listening to audio programs. And there's a lot of money invested, especially now in audiobooks. Like I just listened to The Martian. I listened to The Revenant on audiobook, and I saw The Martian in theater and then listened to it on audiobook, and I thought it was far more better as an audiobook and as a book in general. And then the same with The Revenant. I haven't watched The Revenant yet, and I've listened to it. And that Hugh Glass story as an audiobook was highly produced, background, music and different effects and stuff like that. And I think that's always been there. And you said, has it been the right place, right time for Serial? I think maybe that was just the first one we paid attention to, because I think the quality audio has always been there, but not so much for podcasts.
The medium, right. Podcasting as the distribution means is what I was talking about.
Right. Yeah. In terms of audio, though, like the audio book, that's what made me think about audio or Audible.
Right. But Jeff's point is that it was a risk for them to release Serial as a podcast as opposed to just an audiobook on Audible. Or is that what you're saying, Jeff? Or maybe we misread you.
Maybe that's a side of it. I was just thinking like it was unconventional because the way that you listen to Serial felt like an audiobook to me.
Well, I think that's a good thing to think about there is do something different.
Yeah.
Right? They did something different. They took a risk. Yes. And so in your case, when you said invested a lot, it's a risk. So I say, if you want to add one more to the 3 C's, add risk in there. Take a risk. Do something different.
It's not a C, bro.
It's not a C, but it's, R or
take a
D.
Crisk
or disc or whatever.
Yeah. So, okay, I got a couple more questions I really want to ask you guys. Begin to wrap up. This is somewhat orthogonal to previous conversation, but we've done all these shows about like coding boot camps and like online education, all these new ways that people are learning to code. Another thing that came out of that Stack Overflow survey is that I think most developers, like more than 50%, are self-taught. How important do you guys think that formal programming education is?
Not very for being a productive programmer, but I think it's something that you should backfill as you go out into the workplace, and that you should always be educating. And I think going to traditional means of education is a decent way of backfilling, but no, I don't believe formal education as we've seen it, in America with a 4-year degree system is by any means required. We're seeing many, many people highly successful who are either self-taught or the product of non-traditional education.
I guess something that brings it back home for and adds to that, Jared, is I just thought of this literally on the second here. Traditional schooling reminds me of waterfall versus agile, whereas
yes.
Like you go into college and you say, let me choose a degree and let me spend 4 years learning this thing and hopefully there's a job when I get there. Whereas with self-educated, you're sort of iterating everything I've ever done, and I'm self-educated. I can say I've been taught by others, but I've gotten down this path by my own inertia. It wasn't created by some sort of school or some sort of formal program. And I've iterated through everything, and where I began isn't where I'm at now, but I got here because of where I started. And so I think it's like waterfall versus agile in this case, where traditional schooling is like 4 years degree. Hopefully the job's there. Whereas you kind of now begin with the shiny object, like, oh, I can do that, or I can be in this unique place, and here's a path to get there, and here's another path to get there. And you sort of leapfrog down this path and eventually get to something that, fulfills what you really want to do.
Yeah, okay, I love that. So one more question. Are you guys up against time, or are you okay with one more question?
I'm good.
One more question, that's it. I'm just kidding.
So one thing I find interesting when I think about Changelog and Software Engineering Daily, and then the way I consume software media in general, like reporting on software engineering, it feels like there's some gap between the potential and where we actually stand. Like there's the fairly technical content that I consume that's like O'Reilly or maybe even Changelog or my own podcast, Software Engineering Daily, or watching some video on YouTube that's like a conference talk that's highly technical. There's that, and then there's like other stuff that's more consumable, like Wired or Hacker News, or just these things that are like much more readable, perhaps the stuff you see posted on Facebook, and where it's like, the news sort of bumping up against technology and like how the quote unquote real world is digesting and interacting with technology. And I feel like there is this gap between those two things where the software that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, the highly technical meat, is becoming more and more impactful on the real world. And simultaneously, the real world is becoming increasingly reliant and insistent on consumers understanding how technology works. And I feel like there is this diff between those two things, this margin, and it's getting, closer and closer together. And so I guess I'm curious if you guys feel the same way, and if you have any perspectives on what the future of software media and software consumption by your average, like blue-collar worker, what is that going to look like?
Wow. I would describe software developers as blue-collar because we're the ones doing the work, but I don't know. What do you think, Jerod?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So you want to know how we think software engineering-related media will be consumed by blue-collar non-software workers, or are you referring to like everyday coders?
Consumed by everybody.
By everybody.
So like today you look at whatever, MSNBC. What's the financial news channel? Is it CNBC or MSNBC? CNBC, I think. So CNBC. So it's like it is widely acceptable in the world to have a 24-hour news channel that's basically about money and business. And it's basically the news in the world through the perspective of money and business. And that's what CNBC is. You'll still see stuff about like Donald Trump and Russia or whatever, but it's all through the lens of money and business. So why aren't we looking at the world through the lens of software? Like here's software engineering and here is the world through that lens, because to me, it seems like this super important lever that is being used to impact change on the world, but there is some inability for the average public person to kind of understand how those things are changing. I'm just curious, like,
Or do you think there should be a 24-hour show about software engineering and how it relates to the real world?
I'm not sure.
I think the reason why there's a money channel is because everyone loves money, for one, and it makes the world go around to a degree. Minus
software
gravity,
makes the world go around to a degree.
That's true.
Jeff's point.
Yeah, it does. It does. I don't know. I think
I kind of look at it as like concentric circles. Like you have certain level of technical expertise, and that's going to be your smallest inner circle always. And then you're going to have people that butt up next to that circle, but they're not inside it. And they're going to have their ring of news or media outlets. And then you work your way out. And maybe there's a gap in those rings. But I think you can go from, /r/programming or Hacker News as maybe your inner circle of like, these are the people who are, or even more so, a GitHub issue thread where people are discussing a spec. And then you have, if that makes it to the outer circle, maybe it makes it on Hacker News. And then if it makes the next circle, maybe Tech Meme covers it, maybe not. And so what I think is interesting is sometimes that news does leak out, like in the case of LeftPad, right? And the NPM gate, as they're calling it now, a few weeks back.
Is that right?
Yeah.
NPM gate.
That was reported on the Register, some other news, like just general purpose news sites. And so there are things that make it outside of our little echo chamber and regular people. And if you read those articles, in fact, we almost linked one up in Changelog Weekly, but I just couldn't link it because it was so dumbed down. I couldn't do it because I knew our audience would be like, this is a terrible write-up of this. But for its intended audience, right, it's kind of like the Walt Mossberg version where he's a tech reviewer, but he speaks to the common person, you know? And so his reviews are still very well written, but they're written in a way that I would turn my nose up at because I understand the technical details of the device or whatever. So I think that works itself out naturally. Is there a gap in understanding? Absolutely. But as software engineers, if we're doing our job right, like there should be a gap. Like people shouldn't have to know about this breakdown in the internet infrastructure because, you know, somebody pulled all their repos off of NPM or all their packages. So if we're good at what we do, we can create a black box and regular Joe Schmo doesn't have to care at all. It's when we're bad at it that they end up finding out.
Yeah. Okay, well, cool. I really like that explanation. The way that software technical stuff propagates around the internet. I think LeftPad Gate is a really good example. Jerod and Adam, I really want to thank you guys for coming on the show. I've been listening to Changelog for a long time and a huge fan of the show. So
yeah,
thanks.
Man, that's awesome. Thank you for listening. For how long? What's the first episode you listened to, or how far back do you go? Oh
God, I don't know. Probably something about Ruby, because the first real internship I had was doing Ruby, and that was when I really started listening to software podcasts. But I'm not sure when the first Ruby show you guys did was. So I don't know.
Well, we started with Ruby, so that's the beginning pretty much. Well, I guess our first
all the way back.
Our third show was actually on Go, so that's how far we went back. Right when Go was created, we had Rob Pike on, like way early. I'm just curious because, you know, got your
Sure. I've definitely I'm one of those people who there's maybe a topic I'll have to do. Like I'm doing a show on Software Engineering Daily, and I'll be like, well, you know, time to research this show or this topic as much as I can, and I'll go back and listen to the podcasts about whatever that topic is, and oftentimes that leads me to one of your shows. So I'm a big Greenfield consumer, so I consume the old Evergreen.
That's by design. I mean, we do try to keep the show. We try not to be exactly timely, you know, in terms of like news.
Yeah,
you know, we're not a news show,
right?
We try to be a bit more, you know, timeless with our content and the things we talk about. You know, it doesn't always happen. We obviously mention things that happen today and say today and things like that, but we try to keep it where it's like that. But since we talked about the quality, I'm just kind of curious, since you're an old hat listener, have you noticed a change in quality, not so much just in the content, but also just the audio quality over the years?
Definitely the audio quality has improved. And I think also your conversational style and your level of comfort has improved. Mm. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's just me projecting my own experience onto you guys, because I know that's been the case for me. Like the first shows I did, I was like so rigid and not really comfortable. And over time, you develop an ability to actually have a conversation. You kind of get a sense of what the type of conversation that a listener is hoping to hear. And obviously, you never get to that like best situation. Like I literally cannot go back and listen to my old episodes because I just cringe at myself.
That's how I feel.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that. So
yeah, I feel the exact same way. I want to go back to them, and actually I did this last night as a test just for fun. And I go back and I grab them and I pull them into Audition and I EQ them better and I put a noise gate on them and all those things. And I listen to old version versus how I do it now. And I can actually go back and improve how it sounded even back then. I can't improve how stupid I sound, but I can change how good it sounds.
All right.
So that's been a fun adventure for me.
They really need an audio plugin that does that.
There should be. It's called a human.
Okay, well, thanks, Jerod and Adam. I appreciate you guys coming on.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for having us, Jeff. It was fun.
Okay, cool.